A healthcare pioneer is being compared to visionaries like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. This morning, Elizabeth Holmes is part of the new Time 100 list just out.
By making it easier, less expensive, and much less uncomfortable for you to get tested for a whole range of conditions.
It's about technology, it's about people, it's about the conviction and dedication that an entrepreneur has in going into it to make something work.
A federal district judge says that time is up and Elizabeth Holmes must go to prison.
Now to Elizabeth Holmes, appearing in court to face fraud and conspiracy charges, accused of misleading investors about her blood testing startup.
An appeals court has denied Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes' request to remain out of prison.
Disgraced Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes is fighting to stay out of prison for as long as possible.
Holmes, please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Nothing but the truth?
I do.
Imagine this. It's an afternoon in early September 2014, and you're about to take the stage at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco. You're delivering a TED-Med talk about a new technology you invented that will change the world of healthcare forever. You step on stage wearing an all-black power suit and a black turtleneck, just like your idol, Steve Jobs. You step on stage and you start delivering your speech in a low baritone voice. For the next 20 minutes, you talk about your invention, a medical device that will run hundreds of different diagnostic tests using just a couple of drops of blood from a finger prick. Not only that, the results will be delivered faster, at a fraction of the cost, and with higher accuracy than traditional labs. Your audience audibly gasps when you pull out of your pockets your nanotainer, a tiny vial that holds only a drop of blood. That's all you say you need to revolutionize the world of disease prevention and diagnosis, so that you will never have to say goodbye to a loved one too soon. You're the it girl. Earlier that year, you were on the cover of Forbes magazine, Fortune and Inc. You're the poster girl of Silicon Valley, the youngest self-made billionaire in America, with your startup being valued at $9 billion. The world is talking about your genius and your trailblazing leadership that will save lives and make your investors lots of money. But the thing is, underneath the glossy surface of your carefully curated image and impressive achievements, you're sitting on a bubble of fiction that is about to burst, because the technology that you proudly boast about doesn't exist. The blood analyzer you claim can run hundreds of tests with a single blood drop doesn't work. It can handle at best just a handful of tests, and even those are inaccurate. You spent years taking money from investors, telling them that the product you promised was ready to be launched when actually it never saw the light of day. You discouraged your staff from speaking up and fired and intimidated them when they did. You positioned yourself as a bright and successful leader in tech and basked in the glory of your PR success, while underneath it all, your company was crumbling under the weight of your lies. My friend, this is a story about one of the most colossal frauds that our world has ever seen, where a Stanford dropout lets ambition and fame run her to the ground. It's the story about how one of the most promising startups rose and fell under the leadership of a young woman who lied to investors and customers, covered up her failings, and even put people's lives at risk. This is the story of Elizabeth Holmes and her disgraced company Theranos, and I've not stopped thinking about it for years. The first time I came across this story was in 2021. As an avid fan of true crime, I'd been going down a rabbit hole of podcasts about elaborate cons, pyramid schemes, and white-collar crimes. When I started a podcast called The Dropout, I couldn't get enough of it. From the beginning, I was wrapped up in the story. I've since consumed every bit of content about it. I obviously listened to the entire podcast, watched the TV series inspired by Holmes' story, also called The Dropout. I also read the book by John Carreyrou called Bad Blood. Carreyrou is the journalist who first broke the story about Elizabeth Holmes and her bed of lies through an article in the Wall Street Journal. My low-key obsession with the Theranos scandal and Elizabeth Holmes has puzzled me for a long time. Why do I find it so fascinating? Even more compelling than any other story about fraudulent activity, and we know that there's plenty of that happening every day. I eventually concluded that the pull this tale has concerns our relationship with the stories we desperately want to believe and what happens when we build a business around them. I'm also a believer that business is personal. Businesses are made of people, and those people make decisions, create the culture, form relationships, and ultimately shape how our world operates. The way we trade reflects who we are as a society. You can tell a lot about a person from the way that they lead their business. And Theranos was a bad business. It was a shit show. It created a bad product, it fostered a bad culture, and it was led by bad governance. Oh yeah, and it broke the law. And yet, some of the smartest business people in America were happy to chuck money at it until the bitter end. Let me break down exactly why Theranos was a bad business and why Elizabeth Holmes was a bad leader. Hold on tight, we're diving in. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in Washington, D.C. on the 3rd of February 1984 to her father, Christian Rasmus Holmes IV, and her mother, Noel Holmes. Her father was a vice president at Enron, an American energy company that went bankrupt in 2001 after being investigated for accounting fraud. Elizabeth was 15 years old. As a finance director myself, I just had to look into why Enron failed. During the 1990s, Enron on the surface seemed extremely successful, but behind the scenes, it wasn't actually making as much money as it claimed. Instead, executives used accounting tricks to hide debt and inflate profits. One of their tricks was to record profits on deals immediately, even if the money wouldn't come in for years and sometimes never came in at all. They also set up fake outside companies called special purpose entities, or SPEs, to transfer debt off Enron's books, making Enron appear healthier than it actually was. Shady stuff. Christian Holmes wasn't involved in the fraud itself. Still, I think it's quite a bad omen that Elizabeth Holmes's father was working for a company that ended up covering up its real financial position and catastrophically failing. One of her paternal great-great-great-grandfathers was Charles Louis Fleischmann, a Jewish Hungarian who emigrated to the United States and founded Fleischmann's Yeast in 1868, which made mountains of money. The Holmeses were very proud of their family's history of entrepreneurship and the empire their ancestors built. However, the family fortune was already almost entirely spent by the time they came about. Elizabeth's grandfather and great-grandfather cycled through several marriages and dealt with alcoholism, and Chris Holmes blamed them for squandering the family's fortune. Don't get me wrong, the Holmes family weren't poor or even working class by any stretch of the imagination. They were upper class and very well connected, just not millionaires, you know. Elizabeth Holmes showed early signs of being extremely ambitious. When she was 9 or 10 years old, a family friend asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, and she replied that she wanted to be a billionaire. Careful what you wish for, Liz. She also loved dragging games of Monopoly to the bitter end and wouldn't want to quit until everyone else went broke, as she hoarded more houses and hotels than could fit on the board. If she lost, she'd storm out of the room. Not the best sport. I wonder what it was that made her so ambitious and competitive at such a young age. Was it the story of the family fortune and all the money they could have inherited if only it hadn't been blown on booze and women? Or was it her father's seething envy and resentment at their neighbor and family friend Richard Fuse, who was a wealthy investor and doctor whose success made the Holmes family look insignificant? Maybe young Elizabeth thought she had what it took to restore the family's finances and their prestige to where they were in the golden days. Who knows? What we do know for sure is that her father drilled into her that she had to live a purposeful life, and that's exactly what she set out to do. After a pretty easy childhood attending private schools where she was a straight-A student, Elizabeth was admitted to Stanford in 2002. By then, she was fluent in Mandarin after many years of tutoring and 3 years at Stanford University's summer Mandarin program, which was technically only accessible to Stanford students, but she was so fluent in the language that she wowed the program director, who bent the rules and admitted her. Stanford looks like the obvious choice for her, being strongly linked to Silicon Valley. At the time, the internet was booming, and companies like Yahoo were founded right there at Stanford. So of course Elizabeth wanted to follow these footsteps. Fun fact, during Elizabeth's time there, 2 Stanford PhD students were gaining traction with a little startup which we all know today as Google. No biggie. At Stanford, Elizabeth went on to study chemical engineering and begged her professor Channing Robertson to let her work as a student researcher and lab assistant. Robertson was crazy about Holmes. He was the one who encouraged her to go big after reviewing a patent application that she worked on for 5 days straight. The patent application was for an arm patch that would simultaneously diagnose and treat medical conditions. She was inspired to work on it after spending the summer at the Genome Institute in Singapore, where she tested specimens of SARS that were obtained with syringes and nose swabs. She thought she could come up with better and more modern instruments to retrieve the specimens. Both Elizabeth and her mum were terrified of needles, and this phobia is at the root of what inspired all of her work. Robertson told her that the arm patch idea wasn't quite there yet, but it was a great start, and she should form a company to pursue the idea. The company was initially called Real-Time Cures, and here comes another bad omen. Thanks to a typo, the company name was printed on early paychecks as Real-Time Curses. Whoopsie. She eventually dropped out of Stanford in 2004 at just 20 years old and asked her parents to invest the $30,000 they had set aside for her college education into her company. Holmes invited Robertson to be the first board member of Real-Time Cures and then later changed the company name to a blended word between therapy and diagnosis. Ladies and gentlemen, Theranos has entered the chat. So what was the big idea behind Theranos and Elizabeth's vision? Her dream was to create an innovative piece of technology that would diagnose people quickly, cheaply, and with only a couple of drops of blood. She wanted to wave bye-bye to the big scary needle that would need to suck out tubes and tubes of blood and create something that would make blood testing easier and painless. The idea was that blood testing would become a regular habit, something that you could do weekly or monthly to build a complete picture of your health rather than only once a year. This is a noble idea, of course. However, we'll soon see that it's closer to science fiction than it is reality. Let's take a look at the 4 products Elizabeth and her team came up with over the years. The very first idea that formed the basis of her first patent application was the skin patch. Holmes imagined a patch you'd stick on your arm that could draw blood automatically through microneedles, diagnose illnesses instantly, and even deliver the perfect dose of medicine back into your body. Sounds futuristic, eh? This is an impossible invention. The technology didn't exist and still doesn't. The patch was abandoned early, but it set the tone. Do everything in one device, no matter how unrealistic. Next came the first real machine, the Theranos 1.0. This was a bulky desktop box that promised to run dozens of blood tests from just a finger prick. Inside were cartridges, robotics, and fluidic systems designed to process the samples automatically. But there was one big problem. Capillary blood from finger pricks is unstable. It clots, it varies, and the tiny volume wasn't enough for accurate testing. The result was errors everywhere. The machine was unreliable and never made it past the prototype stage. After the Theranos 1.0 came the one you might have heard of, the Edison. Theranos marketed it as a shoebox-sized device that could perform hundreds of diagnostic tests from a single drop of blood. But again, this was a silly promise. The Edison could barely run 1 or 2 tests, and even those were wildly inaccurate. To make it all work, Theranos had to dilute tiny samples and secretly run them on commercial Siemens machines in the back room. And then finally, Theranos tried to reinvent itself with a mini lab. This was supposed to be a portable lab in a box that could sit in your home, a pharmacy, or even a battlefield. Elizabeth's promises got bigger. Immunoassays, molecular tests, chemistry panels, even blood counts, all inside one box. Basically, it was pitched as an entire hospital lab shrunk to the size of a desktop printer. Of course, the mini lab was as unreliable as all its predecessors. No one at Theranos could make the science work. Theranos was a prototype graveyard. Engineers couldn't get the systems to work together, the accuracy was disastrous, and everyone working on the machines knew they were nowhere near ready to be rolled out to the public. Now, let me explain to you exactly why what Elizabeth wanted to achieve is closer to science fiction than reality. Issue number 1, a single drop of blood is not enough to run over 200 tests, as Elizabeth claimed. There are 4 classes of blood tests: immunoassays, hematology, general chemistry, and microbiology. Each one of these requires vastly different methods, and running hundreds of different tests with a drop or 2 of blood was physically impossible, as there wouldn't be enough blood to test across all the methods. Issue number 2, they diluted the blood. What did they do to resolve the volume issue? They diluted the blood. They literally added fluid, like saline, to stretch that tiny amount of blood into a larger sample. And here's why that completely compromised the results. First, when you dilute blood, you're lowering the concentration of everything in it. Glucose, potassium, hormones, everything. That means the levels can drop below what the test machine is even able to detect. So the blood sample's potassium level could have been absolutely fine, but after dilution, it could show as being dangerously low. Also, you can't just assume that if you dilute a blood sample by 10, the machine's signal will shrink by exactly 10, and then you can simply multiply the result back up. Biology doesn't work like that. Take immunoassays, for example, that Theranos relied on. These tests measure how strongly antibodies and antigens bind together. That binding doesn't scale in a straight line. At low concentrations, the reaction might be too weak to register, and at high concentrations, it can actually overwhelm the test and give a falsely low result. That can be called the hook effect. And it's not just immunoassays. Enzyme tests, hormone tests, even electrolytes can behave unpredictably when diluted. The chemical reactions have thresholds, saturation points, and interfering substances that throw off the math. And finally, different components in blood don't all dilute the same way. Cells, proteins, and electrolytes each behave differently when mixed with extra fluid. So one correction factor doesn't fit all. So you can see how Theranos' testing methods would result in getting wildly inaccurate results. False positives, false negatives, and numbers that could mislead doctors into dangerous treatments. Issue number 3, venous blood is more reliable for blood tests. Elizabeth was adamant that the technology Theranos was building would only need a couple of drops from the tip of the patient's finger. However, if she studied medicine, she'd also know that blood from a finger prick is different from the blood that you extract from a vein with a syringe. It can include tissue fluid and interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between cells, that can alter the concentrations of electrolytes, proteins, or drugs. This, of course, causes a great variability in test results compared to venous blood, and would require careful calibration and faultless precision of the machines that are testing these samples. Okay, so now we know why the product was set up for failure. Let's move on to why everyone hated working at Theranos. Issue number 1, vial management. Introducing Ramesh Balwani, who goes by Sunny. He was Theranos' president and COO since 2009 and Elizabeth's secret lover. Bow chicka chicka bow wow. That's right, her right arm guy was her secret boyfriend, and neither of them thought about disclosing their relationship with the board nor with staff. Sunny and Elizabeth met during one of her stays in Beijing during the Mandarin summer school and got together shortly after when she was 20 and he was 39. In the late 1990s, Balwani sold an e-commerce business right before the dot-com bubble burst and made a ridiculous amount of money, upwards of $40 million. This apparently was enough for him to totally believe he was a super smart and talented businessman. His area of expertise was computer tech. He knew nothing of medicine or biochemistry. However, he latched on to technical words he'd hear scientists say, and then he'd repeat them without understanding what he was saying. Employees would include chemistry words he totally made up in slide presentations, and he wouldn't even realize that he was being made fun of. He was disliked at best and loathed at worst. When staff members raised concerns about the products and their use with patient blood samples, he'd engage in screaming matches with them or write them absurdly long emails berating them and often fire them on the spot. Who the hell wants to work for that guy? No one. No one wants to work with an angry little man who smells his own farts. Mostly due to Sunny Balwani, Theranos had an incredibly high staff turnover rate. This shows how often employees leave a company and then need to be replaced. For some industries, this is expected. For example, it's pretty normal to have a high staff turnover among sales staff in a retail store. These jobs are mainly taken by students or entry-level workers who quickly move on when they come across a higher paid job. However, workers at Theranos were highly skilled workers who were paid high salaries. You wouldn't expect to see them quitting every few months if what they were doing was as inspiring and world-changing as Elizabeth sold it. High turnover is awful for business. It costs money, it costs time, it lowers staff morale, and it makes it very hard to keep a collective memory among employees of what goes on in the business, which in Theranos' case was a good thing, I guess. High staff turnover is usually a symptom of a bad business. Elizabeth would also silo communication between different teams and departments. Everyone reported to her, but the biochemistry team wouldn't know what the bioengineering team was up to, and vice versa. There's no way the stifling communication between teams will lead to a good business or even a good product. If everyone is working towards the same goal, thoughts and ideas need to cross-pollinate between different teams, and there shouldn't be any uncertainty around who needs to know what. Also, Sunny and Elizabeth would hire the best and brightest scientists and engineers in America, but they weren't willing to listen to them unless they had good news to share. That's horrible leadership and a fantastic way to stifle progress and slow everything down. On top of mirroring Steve Jobs' style by always wearing a black turtleneck and black outfits, Elizabeth started using a fake voice where she spoke in a much deeper baritone than her natural voice, kind of like a little bit like this. There are videos of how she talked before she adopted this more masculine low voice, and it's quite jarring to witness.
The draw, and so they did this, what would have been a finger stick on this little nub on. And there's a lot of different elements of our work that to do laboratory testing in a highly accessible way.
I can understand that as a woman, you feel like it's necessary to adopt certain behaviors to be taken seriously, especially if you're operating in a male-dominated space. But can you trust your place of work if its leader isn't acting like herself? Now, let's look at the horrendous governance Theranos had. Governance in the business sense means the system by which an organization is directed, controlled, and held accountable. It covers the structures, rules, processes, and relationships that determine how decisions are made, how performance is monitored, and how accountability is enforced. The goal of good governance is to keep the decision makers in check, especially for companies that attract millions in investment fundraising. In a company, a board of directors is the group of people elected or sometimes appointed to oversee the overall direction and governance of an organization. They don't interfere with the day-to-day running of the business, but they keep the executive team accountable and are overall responsible for keeping everyone in check and ensuring that the company is operating lawfully. On paper, Theranos' board was the dream team. Former secretaries of state, retired generals, political powerhouses such as Henry Kissinger, who was the former US Secretary of State, George Shultz, also a former US Secretary of State, William Perry, a former US Secretary of Defense, and James Mattis, a retired Marine Corps general. These were people who had negotiated peace treaties, advised presidents, and overseen the CIA. What they hadn't done, however, was run a laboratory or regulate medical devices. For a company supposedly inventing a groundbreaking medical device, it's bizarre that there were no experts on new medical technology advancements. Elizabeth Holmes knew what she was doing. If you can show the world that people of that caliber trust you, investors, partners, and customers will be more likely to follow. But the lack of scientists or medical professionals on the board meant that no one was equipped or perhaps willing to challenge the technology itself. In governance terms, this was a board designed to signal rather than to scrutinize. As a leader, you want skeptics in your trusted circle who are ready to ask the awkward questions, to protect stakeholders' interest, and to ensure that the organization stays rooted in reality. Also, Elizabeth Holmes carefully structured the company so that she held the majority of voting rights. That meant that she ultimately controlled the outcome of any big decision. Without her present, the board couldn't even reach quorum, which is the minimum number of directors required to make the meeting official and pass resolutions. This neutered the board's independence. Even if a director had concerns, there was no mechanism to overrule Holmes because the balance of power was already stacked in her favor. It also created the illusion of a governance without the substance. On paper, Theranos looked like it had a lot of oversight, but structurally, all authority still flowed back to Elizabeth. So the board did nothing to mitigate the power Elizabeth had. In corporate governance terms, this is the opposite of healthy leadership. Boards should be able to challenge and, if necessary, outvote management. At Theranos, Holmes designed the system so that she could never truly be outvoted. Let's look at the kind of investors that Elizabeth sought out when she would fundraise. The company attracted wealthy families, political figures, and private investors rather than the typical Silicon Valley venture capitalists who specialize in medical technology. Its backers included people like Rupert Murdoch. Yeah, you heard that right. The guy who owns half of the biggest media outlets of the world. She also got money from the Walton family of Walmart, the DeVos family, and a variety of well-connected individuals in politics and business. These investors had deep pockets and strong reputations, but not necessarily expertise in biotech or diagnostics. So why did Theranos not bring in the specialist venture capital firms? Well, here's why. First of all, the due diligence risk. VC firms that specialize in healthcare and medical devices usually have scientists, clinicians, and technical experts on hand to pick apart the company's claims. If Theranos had opened itself up to that kind of scrutiny, the flaws in the Edison machine would likely have been exposed early. Holmes avoided them deliberately. On top of this, Elizabeth wanted to keep control. Traditional VC investors often demand board seats, voting power, and influence over strategy in exchange for their money. Holmes wanted to keep control tightly in her own hands. Remember her voting rights from before. By going to wealthy individuals and family offices instead, she could raise huge sums without ceding authority or entering probing questions. So the result was a pool of investors who were dazzled by the board's prestige and Holmes's charisma, but who didn't have the scientific background to test whether Theranos' core promise was even possible. In a way, the investor base mirrored the board itself. Impressive names, lots of money, but very little relevant expertise. Since 2003, Elizabeth was able to raise mountains of money. She raised more than $700 million from venture capitalists and private investors, and at its peak, Theranos was valued at $9 billion. 2014 was her golden year. Fortune magazine slapped her on the cover of their June issue, gushing about how impressive she was and how groundbreaking her technology was supposed to be. She was then paraded on the cover of Inc. and Forbes. She gave a compelling speech at TEDMed, and she even got interviewed on The New Yorker. This was the only instance where the author showed some skepticism. The piece points out that Theranos had published little data in peer-reviewed journals. However, in 2015, Elizabeth caught wind that a Wall Street Journal reporter called John Carreyrou was in touch with a couple of whistleblowers who were unveiling her bad practices. In a desperate attempt to win the PR game, Holmes invited Vice President Joe Biden to see her state-of-the-art lab. It later came to the surface that the lab was only set up a few days before. It was made to look like it was fully operational with the mini labs and Edison machines laid out on metal shelves. But it was all a charade to earn a favorable opinion from the public and to have more ammo to fence off the criticism that would come when the Wall Street Journal article was published. To me, the most horrifying bit of the Theranos story is when Elizabeth decided to launch a pilot project with Walgreens, in which the pharmacy chain would invest millions of dollars in setting up clinics where patients could come and have their blood tested on the Theranos machines. Back in 2010, Theranos started pitching to Walgreens, and by 2013 the deal was official. Walgreens and Theranos announced their partnership, and the so-called wellness centers started rolling out in Walgreens stores across Arizona and California. Elizabeth Holmes's vision was for her devices to be available at your corner Walgreens all across America. You'd walk in, prick your finger, and within minutes get fast, cheap, and accurate results. Walgreens bought into the dream. They invested over $140 million, including loans and upfront payments. By 2014, Theranos testing centers were operating in 40 Walgreens stores. Here comes the plot twist. Most of the tests weren't being run on Theranos' Edison machines at all. They were secretly processed on modified Siemens analyzers, the very machines Theranos claimed it would make obsolete. And when internal Walgreens executive raised concerns, Holmes reassured them that everything was fine. Then came the fall. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal expose pulled back the curtain on Theranos' unreliable technology. By 2016, Walgreens halted expansion, demanded answers, and in June officially shut down all Theranos wellness centers. Walgreens later sued Theranos for $140 million, but settled for under $30 million in 2017. A similar story happened with Safeway, a large American supermarket chain. In 2010, Theranos signed a deal with Safeway. Safeway invested a staggering $350 million to remodel more than 800 in-store clinics, preparing for Theranos blood testing devices to be installed. The CEO himself became one of Theranos' biggest cheerleaders. Safeway poured money into new carpeting, clinics, and equipment. But there was one little problem: the Edison machines still didn't work, as we all know by now. Holmes kept promising that the rollout was right around the corner, but by 2013 and 2014, delays piled up, executives became frustrated, and Theranos employees were more and more worried about both accuracy and compliance. By 2015, Safeway quietly abandoned the partnership before a single Theranos test ever reached customers. The result was a disaster, a $350 million write-off, and the whole fiasco contributed to leadership turmoil inside the company. The CEO eventually retired not long after. Now, here's how Theranos actually broke the law. Let me explain what proficiency testing is. It's when health regulators send medical labs a sample to process through the company's normal workflow, and then based on the results, the regulators would pass or fail the lab. Because Theranos knew that their machines didn't work, they told the lab staff to run the samples through the FDA-approved, commercially available machines they had. Theranos didn't alert the authorities of this. They just sent back the results of the FDA-approved machines. My stomach churns just thinking about this. Theranos was telling the government that their proprietary machines worked, when what they were actually using were a bunch of Siemens machines that their competitors made. All the while, Theranos was continuing to use Edison machines to test real patients' blood samples. This had real impacts on many patients. One of them received a worryingly high potassium result from her Theranos test and went on to spend upwards of $2,000 on further testing before it came out that the result was a false alarm and that she was totally fine. Theranos was also accused of presenting to potential investors wildly optimistic projections of revenues and profits. The predictions were 10 or 12 times what was given to an advisory firm they hired to price stock options for employees, and even those figures were optimistic. As a finance director, this is horrifying. You want your projections to be aspirational, yes, but still in the realm of reality. You should be able to explain exactly how it's realistic for you to make the profits you're forecasting. Theranos' financial controller ended up testifying in court that Theranos' financial forecasts were wildly overstated. She said that the company had no revenue at all in 2012 and 2013 and recorded significant net losses, specifically losses of $57 million in 2012 and $92 million in 2013, despite prior projections that had forecast massive revenues. Elizabeth Holmes's dangerous lies were finally brought to light thanks to 3 whistleblowers who began anonymously speaking with John Carreyrou, a talented investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal. The first whistleblower was Adam Rosendorf, Theranos' lab director from April 2013 until November 2013. He started speaking to Carreyrou in late 2014 and told him about the faulty machines. Rosendorf often tried to raise his concerns to Elizabeth and Sonny. He told them about inaccurate results, errors in the lab, and patients who could be misdiagnosed. But of course he was dismissed. Rosendorf later testified that he felt forced to vouch for tests he didn't believe in. The culture at Theranos wasn't built for truth, it was built for loyalty. If you raised problems, you weren't seen as responsible, you were seen as disloyal. Now let's talk about my 2 personal heroes in the story. They are called Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz. In 2014, Erica was a junior employee at Theranos. She was part of the lab team that tested the machine's results and reviewed the data to confirm whether the technology worked or not. She soon formed a friendship with Tyler Schultz, also a junior employee fresh out of college. He happened to be the grandson of George Schultz. Remember him? He was a member of the Theranos board and an investor in the company. Oh, and he was also the former US Secretary of State. No big deal. Tyler and Erica soon understood that the company's practices were illegal and that the blood analyzers didn't work. They would process patient blood samples multiple times, and almost every time the machine would spit out a different test result. They also knew Theranos was lying to the government during proficiency testing, and when they reported these issues to their supervisors and to Sunny Balwani, they were harshly shut down. As a last resort, they even tried to raise their concerns with George Schultz himself, and he didn't believe them. All his faith was in Elizabeth Holmes. He actually encouraged them to quit and move on to another company. Shortly after resigning in April 2025, Erica sent a complaint about Theranos' practices to the CMS, which is the Center for Medical and Medicaid Services. They are the US government agency responsible for ensuring that any lab performing blood tests or other medical tests is compliant with the law. Erica's complaint triggered an investigation that brought to light the massive deficiencies of the lab, halted Theranos from processing patient samples, and eventually led to the company's downfall. Tyler and Erica were also sources for the Wall Street Journal. Theranos caught on to this despite Carreyrou keeping them anonymous. They were both intimidated by Theranos' legal team. Holmes' lawyers were hounding them to sign affidavits where they'd be forced to declare that they had lied to the press and that they didn't know what they were talking about. Tyler's relationship with his grandfather unfortunately deteriorated as a result of this, and he incurred over $400,000 in legal fees as he resisted Theranos' pressure to sign their affidavit. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal finally published their article about how Theranos' technology was miles away from what they had told investors and patients. Elizabeth made some desperate efforts to clear her name by showing up on several news channels and justifying the claims she made about her technology. However, the final blow came after the CMS conducted an inspection of the Theranos lab, which was triggered by Erica Chung's complaint. The report highlighted how big of a disaster the Theranos labs were and how dangerous the Theranos technology was to patients. The company eventually dissolved in 2018, and in that same year, Holmes and Balwani were indicted on multiple counts of fraud. They were sued for securities fraud and criminal fraud, and they were accused of an elaborate years-long fraud, raising over $700 million from investors by making false or exaggerated claims about Theranos' blood testing technology. These included claims of contracts with the Department of Defense and false revenues. They were also allegedly orchestrating 2 schemes, one to defraud investors and another to defraud doctors and patients through false claims about Theranos' technology. Elizabeth's strategy during the trial was to blame everything on Sunny Balwani, claiming he was the one who made all the decisions and she was unaware of the malfunctioning of the devices. Yeah, right. She weaponized the fact that she was allegedly raped at Stanford and that Balwani was an abusive partner, hoping to get the jury's sympathy. While awaiting trial on the fraud charges, she got pregnant with her new boyfriend, Billy Evans, whose grandparents founded a wealthy hospitality company. Holmes gave birth to her first child in July 2021, which allowed her defense team to request a delay in the trial. She then had her second child in early 2023, shortly before beginning her prison sentence. On January 3rd, 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts: 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, all related to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on 4 patient-related charges, and the jury hung on 3 additional investor-related counts, which were later dismissed. She was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. The court ordered to pay $452 million in restitution, shared jointly with Balwani, to the victims of the fraud. On July 7, 2022, Sunny Balwani was also found guilty, but on all 12 counts. 2 counts on conspiracy, 6 counts on investor fraud, and 4 counts of patient fraud. He was sentenced to 12 years and 11 months in prison, plus 3 years of probation. He was also jointly held responsible for the $452 million restitution to the victims. Everything I told you reads like a horror story. Never mind zombies and ghosts. This is the story I tell around a campfire with a torch under my chin. Everything about what Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani did is bananas. It's dangerous, evil, and horrifying in every possible way. I don't think Elizabeth started out wanting to defraud investors and put people in danger. I think things eventually snowballed because she overpromised on a technology she wasn't knowledgeable enough about. When you deal with medical advancements, you need years, decades of experience to really know what you're talking about. Holmes is a sophomore dropout who dreamed about having billions from a young age and thought that razzle-dazzling investors with lies about where the company was with its technology was okay as long as it would eventually catch up with her promises. After all, that's what so many Silicon Valley tech entrepreneurs did and still probably do. They overpromise and deliver products that don't quite meet the expectations they created and eventually find a way to catch up with them. The problem with Elizabeth is that her issues weren't a few lines of code she needed to debug. She had to deal with the reality of physics, chemistry, and mechanical engineering. Many experienced professionals in the biochemistry field could see from a mile away that what she was promising was basically impossible. There was no way this kid with no experience could resolve a problem that Nobel Prize winners couldn't find a solution to. Take one of her Stanford professors, Phyllis Gardner. When Elizabeth first went to her with her skin patch idea, Gardner told her there was no way that kind of technology was possible. But Elizabeth was very good at ignoring naysayers who knew more than she did. I also think that a massive mistake or intentional strategy of hers was to not even bother to seek the counsel of a medical tech expert to add to the company's board of directors. And about that, I couldn't find any evidence that anyone on the board thought about having a medical advisor among them, which rings absurd to me. All of these hotshots she managed to gather round as her board weren't able to put safeguards in place for their own investment. They didn't even find it strange that Theranos couldn't show published peer-reviewed data to prove that their technology was safe to use with patients. They solely relied on Elizabeth and what she was reporting to them. That's the scariest bit. We can criticize Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani all we want, but the reality is that they wouldn't have been able to do the harm that they did if they weren't believed. If any of the board members looked a little bit beyond the surface, they would have seen the truth. Elizabeth and Sunny were obsessed with security and were impossibly strict with who had permission to access which area of the building. But if I'm going to invest millions of my hard-earned cash into a product, I want to see it working, especially if you're rolling it out for patients to use in one of America's largest supermarket chains. There's a massive lesson in leadership here. Go talk to the soldiers. Don't just count on the general. If any board member talked to the lab associates, they'd have heard directly from the horse's mouth that the Theranos machines were failing over and over again. You can't fully trust one person at the top to tell you the truth, especially if they have a vested interest in keeping you happy. Why did no one notice that the product was a disaster? Why did no one lift the lid enough to peer into the pit of despair that Theranos actually was? Who's the adult in charge around here? Is this about greed? Were the investors and board members, all of whom had stakes in the company, blinded by the giant dollar signs that Elizabeth was throwing in their face? Or is this about the irrational American optimism? Here goes a young, smart Stanford dropout who's female and a genius and will change the world as we know it. Well, that's just too delicious not to gobble down. The Elizabeth Holmes story is the most dangerous and intoxicating trust fall Silicon Valley has ever taken, and it hurt badly when it hit solid reality. We humans have this in common. We need to believe in a good story. We're so desperate for it that we often refuse to engage with anything that might jeopardize its happy ending. This is why Elizabeth was able to attract millions in investment, a shockingly impressive board of directors, and the support of business partners such as Walgreens, while having effectively nothing to show for it. What Holmes actually had was a good idea and a lot of charisma. However, a good idea, even a brilliant one, is unfortunately not enough to build a sustainable business that'll change the world. The idea needs to be rooted in reality, and crucially, it needs to be possible. And success earned through charisma alone is short-lived. I think the story tells a lot about the noise of good publicity and how it can obscure the truth that is staring right at you. It tells us that the fake it until you make it strategy doesn't work when you're playing with people's lives. It tells us that fortune and fame are unstable forces, and they will disappear overnight if you build a business like a house of cards. At the heart of all of this, there's an opportunity to reflect on what happens if you wield storytelling as a weapon to get what you want, and what happens when you blur the line between a story and telling the truth. Of course, to this day, in 2025, Elizabeth Holmes still doesn't admit she's done anything wrong. She doesn't acknowledge that her lies directly harmed investors and the patients who received wrong test results from her machines. And she maintains that if the company had been given a little bit more time to perfect the technology, it would still be successful. Is there anyone out there still believing her?